We've heard a lot about fake news over the past year. My subject today is an equally worrisome phenomenon: fake heritage. Recently, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, not for the first time, erupted in violence. What's the big deal with the Temple Mount? Israelis are willing to accept that it is also a sacred place for Arabs, but the Arabs go nuts when the Jews state the obvious, that the Temple Mount was sacred to Jews many centuries before it was even a gleam in Mohammed's eye. The big deal is the moral high ground to be claimed for indigeneity in the area. Being indigenous gets big respect, and more, it often gets UN-approved rights, or at least a moral claim to rights. In fact, being an indigenous people is the jewel in the crown of postmodern oppression. The two hottest social justice files today are transgenderism and indigeneity. The Palestinians are not so very keen on celebrating transgenderism, but the whole indigenous thing has grabbed them in a big way. Violence has not worked to eradicate Israel. So for the last few years, the Arabs have put tremendous emphasis on another strategy, the social justice version of fake news, namely fake heritage. But they don't realize how crazy their fake heritage facts sound to people who trade in evidence-based knowledge. For example, academic Omar Ja'ara, a supposed specialist in Israeli affairs, claimed on a Palestinian Authority TV religion program in 2012 that Moses was a Muslim.
المسلمين من بني إسرائيل الذين خرجوا من مصر بقيادة سيدنا موسى. وللأسف نجد كثير من الباحثين ينكرون هذا الخروج لهؤلاء المضطهدين الذي قام بتحريرهم قائد عظيم مثل موسى المسلم القائد الإيماني المسلم العظيم. The fact that Moses lived somewhere around 1400 before the Common Era and Islam emerged in the 7th century was too trivial a detail to consider before making this insane claim. Ja'ara, who's actually an academic, says Moses was a Muslim who brought the Muslims of the children of Israel out of Egypt. Now, Ja'ara and other Muslims may believe in this fairy tale because it suits Islamic purposes to recast Moses and Jesus as secret Muslims before the birth of Muhammad. In fact, the Palestinian Authority elementary school history books teach that the Jewish claim to the Holy Land is invented and that the land of Israel is really Arabic and Islamic, with no Jewish roots at all. So, from earliest childhood, fake heritage is the norm for Palestinians. But such nonsense should not be taken seriously by international bodies. And yet, these myths are apparently being taken very seriously by UNESCO, the cultural arm of the UN, which designates and protects World Heritage Sites. Recently, UNESCO declared the old city of the West Bank town of Hebron a Palestinian World Heritage Site, ignoring the far more ancient Jewish attachment to Hebron with its tomb of the patriarchs. And on top of ignoring Jewish ties to the Temple Mount, UNESCO has de-Judaized the city of Jerusalem as a whole by referring to Judaism's holiest site solely by its Muslim name, Haram esh-Sharif. By participating in this fake heritage charade, UNESCO is complicit in perpetuating the lie that the Palestinians and not the Jews are the indigenous people of Israel. How do they get away with it? Well, because even educated people are a little confused about the meaning of the word indigenous. The biggest mistake Westerners make is to assume that white people cannot also be members of an indigenous people. They assume that all indigenous people are non-white, colonized, poor, and oppressed. That's because social justice warriors who take up most of the oxygen in the room on these issues will only support indigenous people who are non-white
and who position themselves as hostile to Western civilization. In social justice warrior eyes, Jews are too white, too successful, too non-victim-y, and too cozy with Western civilization to merit the honor of being called indigenous. Well, how do we know who is and who is not indigenous? The working definition of indigenous people was developed by anthropologist Jose R. Martinez Cobo, former Special Rapporteur of the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities for the United Nations. According to Martinez Cobo, indigenous communities, peoples, and nations demonstrate a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that evolved on their territories. They may be non-dominant and even a minority in their lands for many generations, as the Jews in Israel were under many occupiers, and as the Greeks and the Armenians were under Ottoman rule. But they are the only people for whom that specific piece of land has always been considered sacred space. Now, some significant factors in identifying indigenous peoples are continuous occupation of ancestral lands, a common religion or tribal system emphasizing spiritual ties to the land, a common language, and genetically common ancestry, that is, blood quantum. I know that's a charged trope, but it's still a factor in assigning legal authenticity nonetheless, and one that we apply to our own Canadian Indigenous peoples. It's more than a little ironic that supporters of the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction campaign against Israel, accept the premise that the Palestinians are indigenous and oppressed by white Jewish colonialists of European background. They have it exactly backward. It is not Arabs in general, and certainly not Palestinians in particular, who have lived continuously in Israel since time immemorial, but the Mizrahi Jews who have lived there continuously, who were oppressed under a series of imperial regimes up to and including the British Mandate, and the Mizrahi Jews who never gave up their religion, nor their language, nor their spiritual ties to their ancestral land, nor their dream of eventual sovereignty in that land. According to international statutes, Arabs in Jewish lands have the guaranteed rights that accrue to those with long-standing presence, just as Jews ought to, but do not, have rights in Arab lands where they too have had more long-standing presence, along with Christians and other minorities, in some cases, than Muslims. It's therefore pretty ludicrous that in Canada, First Nations activists like those in Idle No More, who themselves meet all UN-approved specifications for indigeneity, have offered full-throated support to Palestinians, whom they perceive as brothers in arms against colonial oppressors. In fact, it is the Jews who meet internationally endorsed measures of authentic indigeneity, while the Palestinians, a people that is literally 63 years old, do not. If you still find yourself confused about who are the real colonizers in the Middle East and who are the colonized, my friend Ryan Belrose, an indigenous Métis Indian who is also a Zionist, has composed a simple checklist that I like. 1. Did you force your language on other people? 2. Did you force your religion on other people? 3. Did you claim and take over other people's sacred sites? 4. Do you deny Indigenous people the right to self-determination on land that you conquered? 5. Did you conquer a large percentage of the known world? If you answer yes to most or all of the above questions, and the Arabs must answer yes to all, while the Jews can legitimately say no to all of them, then you are in fact a colonizing and imperial people, not an oppressed or colonized people. The short version of these questions is, did you take other people's stuff and claim it as your own? If you did, you are guilty of creating a fake heritage. Thanks for watching. To see other Rebel videos, click subscribe.